So now we're going to have a word from the Watershed Nursery. We just saw a lot of conversation about them in the chat. The Watershed Nursery is located in Point Richmond. Owners Laura Hansen and Diana Benner and their team grow hundreds of species of California native plants. They are open Tuesday through Sunday from 10 to 4. You can shop in person in their large outdoor nursery, or you can place an order for curbside pickup. You can reach them at thewatershednursery.com. And online, you can see their plant availability list if you want to see what they carry. And this is just such an adorable photo of the nursery. I always enjoy seeing their charming signage when I go there. So before we go now on to our next presentation, I want to say that if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box on Zoom or YouTube, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can today, and we'll be asking the presenters to stick around if they can to answer questions for you after their presentation is done. So now we'll be visiting Susan Friedman's garden in San Ramon, and she'll be talking about native plant garden design. This is the before photo of Susan's garden, and here is the after. Susan is a native plant garden designer and the owner of Susan Friedman Landscape Architecture. If you're interested in having Susan and her team design your new garden, you will find her contact information under Find a Designer on the tour's website. And Susan will be talking today about how she designed her own garden. So let's go now to Susan. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Kathy. Hello, everybody.
How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. So when did you redesign your garden?
I think it was about 5 years ago when I did the big project. I had been puttering with some things after I first moved in. Took out the junipers and the things that I just didn't like, put in some Arctostaphylos and my Arbutus marina. But about 5 years ago, I undertook a big renovation project.
Well, let's go now and see how Susan designed her garden.
Hello, I'm Susan Friedman, landscape architect, and I'm happy to be sharing my front yard garden with you. In this video, I will be focusing on the design process of how to create an outdoor space. My goal is to help you learn about how to approach the landscape design process. You'll get to see before pictures, during construction, and finished project photos of my front yard garden. You'll also get to see my design plan sketch, my plant list, and a few plant images, along with some fun live videos of garden elements. I hope you enjoy this virtual tour. In the beginning, as a lifelong lover of nature and the environment, sustainability has always been a core value of mine. With a 30-plus year career in landscape architecture, I've run my own design business since moving from Chicago to the Bay Area in 1992. Since college, I've always been interested in native plants, so years ago I studied California native plants. I have a connection to plants that naturally are adapted to wherever we live, plants that use less water in the garden, and plants that are naturally wildlife friendly. I joined the California Native Plant Society to further my knowledge of native plants, then happily discovered BBTN. Having incorporated the principles of native gardens into many projects for our clients, several which have been showcased on past BBTN tours, it was finally time to design my own native garden in my San Ramon front yard. As a landscape architect, designing my own garden was more challenging than I thought. I simply had too many ideas to settle into one direction. My design objectives were to create a unique, fun, colorful front yard filled with surprises, to create a garden alive with nature's activity from insects, bees, butterflies, songbirds, and lizards was another key element. Finally, to create an authentic California native garden requiring no artificial irrigation. After several iterations, my design direction was coming to life. All successful gardens start with good bones. It is the structure and layout of the garden that holds a space together, brings functionality and timelessness. Understanding how you want your garden to function is a key principle in landscape design and requires forethought. For me, a prominent front entrance that is aesthetically interesting was important. The elevation change from my entry walkway to my front door had to be proportional to the size of the architecture and easy to navigate. I enlarged the existing landing, allowing ample room for guests, along with space for personal welcoming touches, such as Corten steel planters filled with succulents. A few steps down, I created a secondary large landing area, along with a seating wall for guests to gather and chat and a good place to decorate for holidays. Incorporation of a seasonal stream was also an important feature. The watershed approach to design is a sustainable design principle, allowing rainwater from the roof directed through downspouts and underground pipes that flow into the natural shaped stream bed. The rainwaters that drain into the stream bed then slowly seep into the ground below, adding additional moisture back to the ground, while at the same time reducing the impact on the municipal stormwater system. The overflow water from the stream bed eventually enters the stormwater system, yet at a reduced volume and slower pace. This slow release of water helps the adjacent creeks from raging too quickly with stormwaters that can often erode and damage stream banks and channels when waters rise and fall too quickly. The seasonal stream bed also acts as a natural filter, cleaning out inorganic chemicals that could also be detrimental to the adjacent riparian environment. Another point of interest, at one end of the dry stream bed sits a recirculating boulder fountain that allows birds to play and bathe and sip the water. The boulder fountain creates a soothing sound as well as an illusion of water flowing into the stream bed even during the summer. The exterior entrance to a home is like entering the interior foyer of the home. It's the first impression people get when they come over to see you. For my design, I wanted to balance the inherent organic garden layout with something more architectural for the hardscape layout. The shapes were a result of getting the right proportions, gaining access along the driveway, as well as access to the front door. I also added natural flagstone garden paths to the side gate and water spigot. The design of strong geometry and floating pavers for the entry added a fun juxtaposition between architecture and garden. For paving materials, I love the rustic style of the Loon Lake stone veneer I chose to face the front walls of the house that I also carried into the step risers for visual cohesion. For the flat paving, I fell in love with a material called violet bluestone that came in all of the sizes and patterns I envisioned. I chose 2-inch thick pieces for wall caps and step treads, a random layout pattern for the large floating paved areas, and a smaller square tile pattern for the main landing. The seat wall was finished with textured stucco painted to blend with the house color. Now that the bones of the design were determined, plant selection was next. Narrowing the plant palette can be a daunting task to most. Things to consider are exposure to sun, shade, moisture and drainage pattern, plant height and function, deciduous versus evergreen, flower, leaf color, type and bloom sequence, plant texture, pollinator attracting, and wildlife habitat. I came up with various categories for my garden: seasonal, dry, wet stream bed, plants for height and screening, lower height and understory plants, accent plants, shade tolerant, and sun tolerant plants. All plants selected would require no water once established, with only a periodic hose shower during the hottest summer days. Adding a protective layer over the newly planted soil is important and also comes with many choices. Mulch protects the soil from erosion, it helps soil retain moisture, and helps keep the weeds down just a bit. As mulch decomposes, it adds nutrients and microorganisms to the soil structure, which is a key to healthy plant growth. Mulch choices fall into two categories: bark, organic types, and rock types. There are many types of barks and many types of gravels to choose from. As a designer, since I like to experiment, part of my garden is covered with medium-sized redwood bark chips, and part of the garden is covered with gold-fine gravels. The two areas are separated in grade with a 12-inch high moss rock boulder wall. No matter what type of mulch is used, it does need to be replenished every few years. Lighting is the icing on the cake for most of my projects. Low voltage LED lighting allows ambience and visibility to navigate the garden at night, as well as extending the usability well into the evening. When viewing the garden through your windows, lighting creates its own framed portrait of your yard. Lighting in my garden includes highlighting the beautiful branch structure of my Arbutus marina, step lights for safety, wall lights for my entry seat wall, and a handful of area lights to bring up plant details and eliminate dark holes in the garden at night. When it comes to maintenance, how much maintenance is needed is a difficult question to answer. One of the biggest myths people believe is that a native garden is low or no maintenance, and that nature will just take care of itself. If you live in a typical suburban neighborhood like I do, maintenance is an important consideration. Many of our beautiful native plants like to spread themselves around naturally through seed distribution, underground runners, and simply size growth. If you are one that loves to play in the garden for hours at a time, then maintenance is a fun aspect of having a native garden. After all, what better way to get to know all of your plants and pollinator friends who visit and live in your garden? Native gardens will need more weeding time than anything. Seasonal cutting back and deadheading, minor pruning, and occasional reorganizing or replacing a few plants are must-do garden tasks. On the plus side, without a lawn, there is no need for weekly mowing, watering, fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides. In conclusion, without a doubt, late winter and early spring are the most glorious bloom times in the garden, also filled with fragrance and pollinators galore. Native gardens show their strength as they endure the hot and long summer days, seemingly unfazed by the weather. Transitioning to fall, some deciduous leaf drop and beautiful seed heads emerge that readies the plants for the quiet period of late fall and winter. Then happily, root zones are replenished with winter rains that kickstart the cycle all over again in late winter and early spring. I love my native garden and the changing personalities throughout the year, season, and years. Native gardening puts me back in touch with nature, physically and spiritually. I notice exciting things every day of the year that are different than the day before and different than the year before. I am grateful to the devotion of the BBTN garden community for showcasing native gardens and teaching us how to make our own native gardens, both large and small.
Well, Susan, that was terrific. Thank you so much. So I want to say that Susan, if you go to the Find a Designer section of the Garden Tours website, you'll find Susan Friedman Landscape Architecture. And under each designer's contact information are links to the gardens they have designed. So Susan has designed 3 other gardens in San Ramon that were just spectacular. We had them on the tour, all of them a few years ago, and they were just so lovely. I also want to say for people who had questions about the plant list, if you go to Susan's garden, if you go to the agenda for today, you can find a link to Susan's garden with her plant list and additional photos. And you can also find that by looking under the 2021 gardens. So your garden looks great, Susan. It's really matured since I saw it a few years ago.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, I'm really happy with how it's really grown up. And really, I haven't, last year I didn't do much on my garden, and it just seemed to like the lack of care. And it's just exploded. It's really fun to see that.
We had a question about water. So your garden is 5 years old. You're in hot San Ramon with a hot summer. So what do you do for watering?
Yeah, actually, I chose to not put in any artificial irrigation system in my front yard. It was an experiment, and I actually just hose water my plants. When they went in the ground, we did deep soaks on each individual plant, watered them by hand as they got established. The first year really had to pay closer attention to the watering, but I literally almost never watered the garden. Only in the really hot summer when things look just a little off, and I just feel like I want to get in the garden and give them a little bit of a sip of water. So yeah, there's no artificial irrigation. Now for our projects, we do put in mostly inline drip system. It's like the Netafim system with the brown pipe. That gives people flexibility to, control their system, especially if they're not available to go out and hose water. Or as they put in new plants that need additional water, you will need to get out there with a hose and give it a little bit of an extra drink.
When we had our garden installed many years ago, we put in Netafim. It's net, like I'm throwing a net, N-E-T, Netafim. And we watered for the first couple of years, and then we just tapered off, and now we don't water at all. But during the drought a couple of years ago, in the third year, I did water once in July and once in August. It just seemed the humane thing to do. But otherwise, my garden is not watered at all these days, and it really looks great.
Yeah, and you save a lot of money by not installing an automatic irrigation system if you're willing to do the work and get out there in the garden.
So let me see, I'm wondering, through your business, do you do just consultations, or do you just go and do full designs? How do you work?
Mostly we do full designs. We do occasionally we'll do consultations. Really, it's a function of the time that we have for our staff to do the work of our designs. But we do, we do consultations every now and then.
Okay.
Right now, everything is on Zoom, but we're starting to get out there on site a little bit more often.
Yeah. Thank goodness, huh?
Yes.
So I saw that initially you had planted pretty sparsely in your newly planted pictures, but the garden really filled in. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when we were studying which plant to put in the different locations, we really considered the mature size of each plant. And also the location, the sunshade pattern, as I mentioned in the video, the drainage pattern and things like that. So each one of those plants were 1 gallon containers. And I knew ultimately that they were going to grow and fill in together. Probably the biggest surprise is the plants that reseed themselves, like obviously poppies, blue-eyed grass. I really didn't realize how quickly they spread. This year, the whole creek bed has been aligned with the blue-eyed grass, which is so pretty when they're all blooming. And then the yarrow has really formed a blanket of just mat of, complete filled in yarrow. So when that's blooming, it has a beautiful effect. So I'm really surprised by that.
So you have a recirculating fountain that's like a smaller piece that's like at the top of your dry stream bed. Is that correct? And they're separate. Would you talk a little bit about that?
The recirculating boulder has a basin that it sits on. And so the basin has a mesh, like a mat on the top of it. And there's decorative rock that covers the basin. You don't see it at all. And so it integrates really nicely into the natural rocks of the dry stream bed. I turn it on with a switch. Even when it's off, there's a beautiful boulder. So I can control when it's on or off. And I also fill that with a hose. I don't have an automatic refill. on my boulder fountain, but that is available for people if they wanted to do an auto refill valve.
So that allows you to have the sound of water flowing all day long when you're using just a little bit of water, and your dry stream bed, it really functions in the rain. Is that correct? So to capture the rainwater and keep it on site?
Exactly. Yeah. It's the function is I have it tied into two downspouts, as well as in the video, there was a Corten planter on my front porch landing, and it drains, the pipes drain also into the dry stream bed.
Nice. So that was a beautiful red bud you had a photo of.
Thank you. That I actually planted, I think about 3 years ago. And I love red buds. It's definitely on my favorite tree list. That and Arbutus marina is another big favorite of mine. I love the red bud when it's in bloom, and I love the heart-shaped leaf that comes out after they're done blooming, as well as they have a beautiful branching structure. So it's a great, great plant.
Can you talk about some of the other large structural plants that you tend to use in your designs?
Well, one of my newer favorites these days is the Dr. Hurd manzanita. I love manzanita. Dr. Hurd actually can get quite large, as I'm finding out in the location that I planted mine a few years back. But I love kind of the rounded silvery green leaves, and then the beautiful color of the branching structure. It's just the perfect plant, and it requires virtually no water. I've had Dr. Hurd planted on sites where they get too much water, and they don't like it at all. So that's a structural plant that I love. I also have a little Garia that's kind of hidden in the garden. Garia are very slow growing, but they're very interesting plants. They have those little, droopy panicles of flowers. And they're just kind of, underappreciated little plants. I put that in the location with a deer grass right next to it. So I love how the textures kind of play against each other, because Garia has like a thicker leaf and a bolder leaf pattern. And then the deer grass is a very fine textured plant sitting right next to it. So I really love that. Another plant that I'm very surprised at how large it got was my Verbena lilacina de lamina, with that sweet fragrance of it. I planted a 1 gallon container plant. Again, it was probably maybe 3 years ago, because that was the second phase of my garden in the front. And it is one plant alone. It's at least a 3 foot wide by 3 foot tall shrub, no water. It just does its thing beautifully. I love that plant so much.
And they're long bloomers, aren't they?
They really are. That was also a really great surprise. They bloom well into the summer, and the fragrance is kind of surprising. You don't know where it's coming from in the garden, and then you go up to the verbena, and it's just a really sweet, subtle, not overpowering fragrance. It's just lovely.
So the Garia we were talking about is called Coast Silk Tassel, is the common name. And you can find Susan's plant list on the website on her garden tour page. So you listed a lot of factors that you considered in the design of your garden. And also the proportionality between the hardscape areas. I thought that was really interesting. How you thought about your landing and your entryway and how they would fit in. Is that how you started then, by thinking about your hardscape and moving then into the softscape later?
That's typically, as a designer, I look at the overall space and the proportions, and of course what the requirements are of the project. And then it's a matter of putting the pieces of the puzzle together in a way that flows. It accomplishes your goals of getting from point A to point B. In my case, I wanted to expand the size of the landing. I know people always love to gather by their front door. I call it my hello goodbye space. And so I wanted to expand a second, small landing that was also connected to the entry with that seat wall that you saw. And it really is a fun little space. It kind of naturally steps up, and it makes the space more inviting proportionally. So structural elements, for me, that's where I start as a landscape architect. you know, a lot of it is architecture. So we want to make sure that the spaces are functional, proportional, and then sort of lay the layers on top of that with plants and irrigation and lighting and grading, drainage, and things like that.
We had a question about your mulch, and it was, did you have a preference, I think, between the different kinds of mulching that you used in your yard?
That's a good question. Do I have a preference? In the native garden setting, I actually prefer the gold fines. I prefer more of a natural gravelly type material. I think it's better for drainage for the plants. They just seem to go together visually a little bit better. The bark mulches, to me, are, you know, good for more of the woodland type gardens where there's a lot of tree and shrub cover. It just sort of an aesthetic sort of thing. And but you know, either way, we've done both. The gravel mulches are more expensive than the bark mulches. And it's really a kind of a personal preference, in my opinion. There's probably, Kathy, you may know a little bit more on, you know, some of the technical reasons of doing the gold fines. But I like the gold fines in the native garden, any kind of drought tolerant garden.
We used it in ours. It's small, it's granite, isn't it? Like finely ground up granite. But
Yeah.
we found that because we were not at that time and we don't always take our shoes off, that we would track it inside, and we just foresaw it ripping our hardwood floors apart. So we eventually, it was lovely, but we eventually got rid of it. And I was told later that it's best used at a distance from the house, so you have a chance to like let it scuff off your shoes. But we don't have that kind of distance in my garden, so we moved to a flagstone patio. But if we'd been more responsible with our shoes, we would have enjoyed having the gold fine.
Right. And having pathways go, you know, traversing through the garden gives you an opportunity to walk on a harder surface rather than right on the mulch or the gold fines. So it depends on how you want to use your garden and maintain it.
Well, yours is certainly lovely. I want to say, if you'd like to contact Susan, you can go under the Find a Designer page on the Garden Tours website, Susan Friedman Landscape Design. You can see her own garden and also other gardens that she has designed. And you'll know that these are gardens that are water conserving and hardy and can take these hot inland summers and still look great. So Susan, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Can you stay on the chat and Zoom and help me answer some questions?
I think so.
Okay, so if you have any questions that we didn't have answered, you can put them into the chat. And thank you so much, Susan.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll be going now to talk for a moment about a new fundraiser. It's the San Lorenzo High School Environmental Fund fundraiser. For the last 8 years, San Lorenzo High School's Environmental Club has participated in the Bringing Back the Natives Garden Tour. Some of you may have shopped there on the day of the tour. As students in the Environmental Club, the Druids grow out more than 70 species of native plants in the school's productive native plant nursery. And here's a bouquet of native flowers. The students planted, they created, and they still plant in and maintain the school's 1 acre native plant garden. It's now 20 years old, and it is really something to see. Environmental Club students also lead field trips for local classes for elementary students on Native American uses of California native plants. These field trips are attended by hundreds of elementary school children each year. The annual plant sale that the club holds on the day of the tour normally raises thousands of dollars for the club each year. However, the pandemic has caused the cancellation of the sale in 2020 and again this year. To help make up for this loss in funds and to create opportunities for these students, funds are being raised to create a paid internship program for Environmental Club students. many of whom will be the first in their families to be going to college. My son, Peter May, who is 22, will be biking solo across the country this summer. He'll be pedaling down our driveway in San Pablo on the morning of June 1st and heading to Massachusetts. His biking trip is a fundraiser for the San Lorenzo High Environmental Club's students. The goal is to raise $5,000 that would be used to fund internships for low-income students. Peter will be bicycling 4,000 miles. He's hoping to raise pledges of 125 cents a mile in order to meet his goal. A penny a mile would be a pledge of $40 coast to coast. 2 cents a mile would be $80 coast to coast. 100% of the proceeds from this fundraiser will go to the internship program. If you're interested in helping out kids who could use a helping hand and supporting this great environmental program at San Lorenzo High, or if you are captivated by the idea of someone bicycling for good, this is the fundraiser for you. If you would like to support this effort, you can go to the tour's homepage. There you will find a link to the San Lorenzo High fundraiser.